Well, welcome to the Chicago Council on Science and Technology. This program today is Investing in Innovation for the Future of Science and Technology. As most of you know, Chicago Council on Science and Technology is working to raise the awareness and the importance of science and technology in our region. We've produced over 70 programs, partnered with over 65 organizations, and have nearly 400 members, some of which yourselves in this audience today, to help us in these efforts. And we encourage all of you to support us, continued support in these efforts. And if you are not a member, please become one today. Just a reminder that there will be a book signing after the talk today, and if you could please turn off your cell phones to vibrate. We are live streaming today, so thanks to those of you who are connecting via computer. And now I want to introduce Dennis Roberson, Vice Provost and Research Professor with the Illinois Institute for Technology and President of CEO of Roberson and Associates, technology and consulting firm serving a variety of government and commercial customers. Dennis also serves as the U.S. Federal Communication Commission's Technology Advisory Council and the U.S. Commerce Department's Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee. Previously, Dennis served as Motorola's EVP and CTO and held executive positions at IBM, Digital Equipment Corporation, now Hewlett-Packard, AT&T, and National Cash Register. Dennis is our moderator for today's talk, and Dennis will be introducing Dr. Robert Atkinson. Thank you very much, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Erin, and welcome all to the second day of spring. I'm sure that you're all enjoying the beautiful spring-like weather that we feature in Chicago. I really am honored to be here and to have the opportunity to introduce our guest. He pointed out, as I asked earlier what I should cover, he said the smaller coverage, the better. I thought that was a great step of humility, but he then added that the sooner I get off the podium, the sooner he gets on, which had a little different ring to it. I am pleased to be here, though, and as I was approached by a C2ST team to provide this introduction, I'm sure mostly as a come on to get me here, it was, you are the ideal person to provide this introduction. And I thought about that for a while, and there is some rationale for that. There's never an ideal person, but my background is very heavily invested in the whole process of innovation, and you've already heard a brief bio, but I'm going to punctuate that in a little different way. I have had the opportunity over the years to be directly or indirectly engaged in a lot of the key innovations in the information technology industry. Starting at Bell Labs and producing the first digital display telephone, so all of the telephones that have that funny little display, either a professional telephone or your cell phone, in one small indirect way emanate from work that I did early on. I had the opportunity to help develop the personal computer, which seems to have had some impact over the years. I've also had opportunities in a variety of other areas, and I won't enumerate them, but that's been a very important part of my life, this whole business of innovation, creating the future. And that's really the message that you'll hear this morning, the importance of creating the future and of being a part of that future. I will share one other thing, one other prop before the introduction, and that's a small plaque which none of you can read, but it sits in a prominent place just inside the door of my office. And I read it somewhat regularly, and I'll read it for you. It's a picture of a typewriter, an Underwood typewriter from days of yore. It says, "The market for typewriters lasted almost 100 years. Today, your existing products have a market window of 18 months or less. When was your last breakthrough innovation?" And it's a nice thing to greet me every morning, to remind me of the importance of innovation, and I think you'll get some of those reminders today. To turn now to the proper introduction for our speaker, Rob Atkinson is a very distinguished person in the Washington area. He has the Information Technology and Innovation think tank operation that he founded and that he presides over. He has a very illustrious career, and we were joking about this a bit. He has been appointed to commissions by 3 successive presidents. That therefore means he has had 2 Democrat and 1 Republican president who have appointed him to major commissions. He's been involved in major White House activities, but the fact that he is able to go cross-party at the presidential level is a very significant capability by itself. He's also testified quite frequently before Congress, and he pointed out that roughly half of the invitations have come from Democratic congressmen, senators, the other half from the Republican side. So he really is truly bipartisan. He's been featured on almost all of the major news broadcast major networks, and that also gives you the full range of his background when you think of from Fox to MSNBC. He covers the full plane very, very effectively. So having not quite met the criteria of a very quick introduction, let me now introduce Rob Atkinson, the author of Innovation Economics, a book that I do recommend that you read. It's very, very powerful. I've also had an opportunity to preview the slides that you'll present this morning, and they're very, very powerful, very compelling. A lot of data, never the full story that is written up in the book, but a good flavor for the huge challenges that we face in America in this area of innovation. So with that, Rob, thank you so much for being here.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Move that over here to get it away. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I have to say I'm impressed with this venue. Really, I feel like I should give a benediction before I start. So I'm going to try to keep this somewhat short, and if you are compelled to ask a question or make a comment while we're going through this, it's somewhat of a intimate group, so feel free to just raise your hand and we can kind of go with that. So I want to start with just a quick personal note. I grew up in Wilmette and until I was 18, went away to college and never came back. My parents moved away and didn't have family here. But when I was here, it was in the late 60s, and it was really, when you think about it, this was sort of the zenith of the Midwest. It was really kind of the early 70s, late 60s. I mean, it was really, that was the peak. I mean, I remember I used to get in sort of bets with my family, my brother, like, would Chicago be bigger than Los Angeles? And it turns out that kind of was this point where the Midwest kind of had ridden the industrial wave after World War II and really dominated this emergent mass production economy that really was created after World War II. And it was really centered here in Chicago, in Detroit, in Cleveland, and other places like that. And then that sort of center of gravity, if you will, of economic growth shifted, and it went south, and it went west. And the Midwest, Midwest continued to grow. Midwest economy is better today than it was 40 years ago. I'd rather live here today than I would 40 years ago. But what I want to argue essentially today is that process of sort of hitting a wall, if you will, and getting slower relative growth, slower relative development that the Midwest hit back in the early 70s. It was really the same dynamic that's going on today and has been going on now in the United States for the last 10 years or 12 years. The U.S. now is like the Midwest, if you will. It's more stagnant, it's slower growth, and it faces much steeper and stiffer competition. And that, to me, is really the kind of the thing that almost nobody is acknowledging today in our politics. We're having these debates about what we should do and what, is the recovery going to occur? And I want to argue that really what we need to be thinking about is a much more structural analysis. So I want to talk about a few things. What's the diagnosis of the problem we have today? What's the cause of it? What do we need to do to fix it? And then how do we overcome those hurdles? So if you think about this line, this is an unprecedented line. The red line is essentially the employment recovery since the Great Recession. This is, again, you can see unprecedented. The black line is 2000, the other line is 81. So each recession we've been having is worse and worse and worse in terms of employment recovery. So this is, again, sort of unprecedented. You have to go back to the Great Depression to get these kinds of employment lines. Now, why did that happen? Well, it's pretty clear everybody agrees that the Great Recession was caused by the financial collapse, and the financial collapse was caused by the housing bust. So if you look at, for example, the Case-Shiller 20-city index, it doubled in a period of 6 years. So in other words, housing prices from the late 90s to the sort of 2006 period doubled. Now, your house value didn't really double. Your house is worth actually less each year that goes on because of depreciation. Your house doesn't get to be worth more. It's not like Apple stock. Apple stock is worth more because Apple's a more valuable company. Your house is not. So what caused the housing bust? This is something no one really talks about. Well, it was sort of irrational exuberance. People just kind of got crazy, sort of like the tulip bulb craze back in Holland. And just wondering there's my water, beautiful. So what we argue in the book is that what caused the housing bust was essentially that the demand for real capital investment dried up, or certainly shrank. So if you think about the way capital allocation works in our economy, we have these people who are called savers. They could be foreign or domestic, individuals or companies. They have money, and they put it into these intermediary organizations called banks or other types of financial institutions. And those banks or other things, they go out and they say, yeah, we'll give you some of that money because we think we're going to get a return that's net present value positive. Now, when the demand for that money goes down, what do? Well, normally what an industry would do when the demand for its product or services go down is they would shrink, they would downsize. That's not what happened. Wall Street did not want to downsize. The financial community didn't want to downsize. And so they said, what else can we lend money to? And they said, aha, let's lend money to housing. And so they essentially changed their entire lending rules to pour money into the housing market, not just at the subprime level, but at other levels, and created this massive housing bubble. So we essentially went from an economy of making things to making money. Because we weren't making things in any serious way as much as we were before, companies that used to make things, like Motorola, the demand from those kinds of companies for capital in America declined. So what happened? Banks then invested in high-risk mortgages. Individuals who now were suffering from somewhat stagnant incomes and who had been burned by the dot-com stock market crash thought that housing was an investment in and of itself. So they put money into housing because they thought that was where you were going to make real returns. A lot of people blame Chairman Greenspan. Why did the Fed keep interest rates so low? But what they forget is the Fed kept interest rates so low for so long because the underlying structural problems in the economy were limiting its growth. We just weren't getting back to growth after the 2000 bust. And so the Fed kept interest rates low because that's the only thing Washington really knows how to do. So then, as I said, we had this Case-Shiller doubling. That's inevitable that it had to stop. And then it cascaded down. People lost their homes. Banks couldn't pay the mortgage, couldn't get the money. They stopped lending, and you have this financial collapse today. So here's a few statistics. Sorry for some of the rendering doesn't come out quite right, but essentially what this shows is the blue line is the amount of investment that U.S. corporations make in plant, equipment, software, machines, the things that they get money for to build something and become more productive and more innovative. That blue line essentially went up over 70% in the last 5 years of the 90s. The orange line was housing. So there was much more investment in real things in the 90s, last half, than there was in housing. The first half of the 90s, you can see this dramatic drop-off in corporate investment. And pretty much the money just kind of shifted over and went over into housing. You see the same thing when you look at the ratio of loans that banks make. If you think about banks, they make commercial and industrial loans, and they make consumer loans, autos and houses and things like that. And the ratio went down significantly. It used to be about 75% commercial, went down to about 30% commercial. So banks just shifted over and made loans to individuals. Now, you see this in other places. This is the growth of capital investment by U.S. companies. And you can see in that last 5 years of the 90s, 80% growth. So companies were adding new machines, new computers, new software, new buildings, driving economic growth. That was why the 90s was so good. 11 years, and we've only gone up 20%. So something fundamentally different happened. And you can see the same, oops, sorry. All right, that didn't show at all. Essentially what that shows, one sec, what that shows on this slide is venture capital dropped dramatically by about 80%. And if you could see that, IPOs as well, and initial public offerings dropped about 80%. Yes, sir?
Just a sort of question / comment. There were political inputs that were responsible for some of that shift as well. Community Reinvestment Act, Barney Frank's famous comment, let's roll the dice on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, loosen lending standards. So there were congressional and political inputs that helped shift that balance. Is that sort of correct, or is it all just bank decisions that did this?
You know, that ends up becoming a very sort of partisan or ideological point. People, not your point, but there are people on one side. If you're on the left, you'll deny that. If you're on the right, you'll put all of the cause onto that. And
I'm just saying it's one factor.
right, exactly right. So if this were a regression model and you had a bunch of coefficients, and one of the coefficients was public policy dictating. By the way, this was a Bush administration policy too. This just wasn't Democratic, Republican. Everybody got into this ownership of society. That played a role, but I would encourage you to read a book. If you haven't read this book, it's a fantastic book called The Lost Bank, and it's by Kristen Gillibrand, I believe. And Kristen is a reporter for the Seattle Times, or whatever the newspaper was there. And she wrote this book on WAMU, Washington Mutual, which started out as this sort of sleepy little regional mutual. It made a loan, it was going to get paid back. And it ended up sort of getting taken over, not taken over, this new CEO decided he wanted to be this, Wall Street kind of guy. And you read that book, and it's pretty clear that almost all of their decisions they were putting massive amounts into subprimes as late as end of 2006. And the bank ended up going bankrupt and, had all these problems. So, yes, part of that was true, but I think there were other underlying factors of these companies they were wanting the bonuses so badly, and they were wanting the quarterly profits so badly. The idea that they would sort of be the last one in this game of musical chairs, you don't want to be the last one standing, and so everybody was just jumping in. So it's a factor, but I don't think it's the sole factor, or even the most important one. Okay, so while that was going on, this is getting a little closer to what I think was really going on. And this is essentially what foreign direct investment flows. And what you can see is after 2000, there was a very large increase in outward foreign direct investment. In other words, U.S. multinationals taking their money and putting things overseas. In contrast, foreign companies, foreign multinationals, were investing less in America. And what we've seen, given that number through 2009, what we've seen is inward FDI is declining in America 6% a year over the last 10 years. So just, you'll hear cases in the paper about Siemens building a factory in Virginia. It's not that those are not happening, but they're just not happening at a very rapid pace. In fact, 85% of all foreign direct investment coming into America now is purchases of American companies. so-called greenfield investment, where companies would come in and build a factory or a research lab, those are down about 8% a year every year. So companies now increasingly are going overseas. They're not investing in America. And this is one result of that. So I would encourage you to show this slide to your economic development department. What this is there's a group that tracks major industrial openings, plant openings, and relocations. So if you're a major company and you decide you want to open up a factory and you decide where to put it in the U.S., you go down and put it in Alabama, that gets counted as one. Or if you're a company and you say, we're going to move our factory from Illinois to Alabama, that gets counted as one. And you can see in the last half of the 90s, there were over 5,000 of these things. These are the things that state and local economic developers are hungry for. They go out and they want to lasso that smokestack, if you will. You can see now that it's going at about half the rate that it used to go. There simply are a lot fewer of those new plant openings and relocations within America. And the reason there's a lot fewer is they're going overseas. So, what's really behind all that? What's really behind all of this is this new globalized economy where the U.S. simply is not winning in this race. And again, you can't see that. But basically it shows, as you see, the trade deficit exploded. It went from about $100 billion, a little bit actually $70 billion in the 90s, to about $800 billion in the 2000s a year. Again, you can't see that story. Basically what that shows, manufacturing employment in the 90s declined 2%, and in the 2000s it declined 33%. So this was the worst loss of manufacturing employment in American history. It was worse than in the Great Depression. We lost a bigger share of our manufacturing jobs than we did in the Great Depression. And all but one state, Alaska, had manufacturing employment losses. You can see Illinois pretty much close to the average, about 32.6. National average was 33.5 or so. So you did a little better than the national average, but that's not something really to brag about. So you can see, if you looked at that graph in 1985, what you would see would be these purple and green lines, boxes concentrated in the Midwest, the Rust Belt. Now you see that those losses are pretty much everywhere. Massive losses in the South, which, you know, if you remember back in the 80s and even the 90s, factories moved from the north to the south. Now they don't do that. They move from any place in the U.S. to any place outside the U.S. So you can say, well, that's all, you know, who cares about manufacturing? Again, you can't really see that. Because we know we're an innovation economy. Well, first of all, that ignores the fact that many, many innovation firms are manufacturers. Motorola, Boeing, Intel, Cisco, Amgen, those are all manufacturing companies. But leaving that aside, how are we doing, quote, on innovation? So this is a study we did called the Atlantic Century. We benchmarked 44 countries on a bunch of different innovation factors. How much corporate R&D is the country doing? How many scientists and engineers do they have? How many scientific researchers? How much venture capital? How many new business starts? Yeah.
What study was it? The Atlantic Conference?
This is a study we did called the Atlantic Century.
Atlantic Century.
Yeah, this is all on our website, which is... That was 2012, I think. Yeah, 2012, 2011. Yeah. What that study showed is that the U.S. still, so if you look at these 44 countries, the U.S. still does okay. We rank number 4. So you can say, well, what's the problem? We're number 4. You know, Singapore's number 1. Sweden and Finland are ahead of us. Not bad. Well, if you go back now and look at where countries were in 2000 and where they were in 2011, although most of the data is 2009, 2010, and say, how much progress did these countries make? How many scientists did they add? How much venture capital did they add? How much money did corporate R&D add? We rank 43rd out of 44 countries. Only Italy is behind us. So that's pretty bad. You never want to be behind Italy on any ranking. But in this case, we're 43rd out of 44. Now, the leading country is China. That's not a big surprise. You know, they're coming from a low base. But there are a lot of countries that are advanced countries that we're making much more rapid progress. France, Germany, Japan, Korea. Now, you can say, well, we still have this great innovation system, and we do. But what I think most Americans, including many Washington policymakers, don't understand what's happened in the last decade is these other countries have not been sleeping. They have been putting in place an array of policies to win. So, for example, we no longer have the most venture capital in the world as a share of our economy. We're about fifth. There are a bunch of countries that invest a lot more in venture capital than we do. We're nowhere near the top on corporate R&D. We're nowhere near the top on a bunch of other factors. Yeah?
When you say countries, are you talking about state-directed capital investments, or talking about cartels of private investors?
What's the last part?
Or cartels of private investors, like venture capitalists?
Well, the venture capital is principally going to be private money. A little bit public here and there, but mostly private. But on that study, we measure, so for example, we have one measure that's just publicly supported research and development. We have a measure that's just private supported research and development. So it's a wide variety of indicators. And as I said, collectively, and even many of individually, we're falling behind.
Do we want to stop and switch for your slides, because a lot of these aren't showing up?
We could.
Would that be all right, Dennis?
You want to use my computer?
Yeah. Yeah, if we can use
Why
yours,
don't I keep going through this?
Okay, and I can just...
You can load this up.
That'd be great.
Since I had an opportunity to preview, these are great slides. I'm feeling quite bad for you having not having the...
And are they on here yet, or...?
No, they're not. I'm going to have to put in the password on that, so... Yeah.
With these indicators, I think infrastructure is another very critical one, and I almost feel that we have an infrastructure that was built in the 20th century, and that's kind of where it's stayed, especially information infrastructure, communication infrastructure. I mean, Google's expanding in that area, but it's still pilot and trial programs. Does that study have rankings like that for
that study does have broadband. So one of the 16 variables is broadband. There's a study on our website from January. Is that, let me know when you want me to put the password in. There's a study from January we did on international broadband rankings. And actually, that's a little different. We actually rank a little better than people think, believe it or not. We've made, in the last 4 years, we've actually made a lot more progress than a lot of countries on broadband speeds. We now rank 7th in the world on broadband speeds, which is, a lot of people don't know that. So broadband's actually, we're not doing as badly, I think, as some people think. We're behind the leaders like Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, Japan, who have, pretty widely deployed 100 megabit networks, even a little faster. But we're actually ahead of Europe on broadband overall. So I can, yes, sir.
One problem is that now we see that some politicians want to cut back and financing our universities. And then the worst time when we're already cutting back in manufacturing. You hear about reports that we want to cut it. They don't come out and say so, but they say, well, we're producing too many college students, but that's which I think is terrible.
Yeah, so if you look at and I'll show some numbers here. So if you go to that report, what you'll see is a decade ago we were close to the top on the production of scientists and engineers from our colleges. We're nowhere near the top anymore. We were close to the top in terms of the overall ranking of 24 to 30-year-olds, I think it was, with a college degree. We're nowhere near the top anymore. So a lot of countries that have a much higher rate of college completion than we do. And I think you can argue about various things, but I think that fundamentally, you'll see some other slides here, we simply have disinvested in a wide variety of innovation infrastructures, including our higher education system. So, yeah.
When you say ranking in terms of producing science and engineers, are you talking about just sheer numbers, or are you talking about compared to jobs available for them when they graduate?
No, all of those numbers are as a share of the economy, and so any kind of employment numbers would be as a share of overall jobs, not science jobs, but scientists and engineers as a share of the workforce. So there's a big debate in the U.S. whether we have a shortage. I think we do have a shortage of STEM workers, and I think we would have an even bigger shortage if we were actually much more competitive in STEM. I'll go here and then here. Go ahead, yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar, but in 2007, the Urban Institute came out with a study, Hal Saltzman, Lindsay Lowell,
Sure.
producing 2.5 to 3 times more STEM grads than there are jobs.
Yeah.
And an American Community Survey based on the 2010 census said there were over 100,000 engineers under the age of 65 born in the U.S. who are unemployed, plus 1.47 million engineers who effectively in engineering are not doing anything.
Yeah.
Aligned with the work that they have to do.
Yeah, so I'm quite familiar with Hal's study, and I dispute it. If you want to really get into the details of how and why we dispute it, there's a report on our website called Refueling the U.S. Innovation Economy, which is a fairly, for us, a long report. It's like 280 pages. Analysis of STEM and what we should do to fix the STEM problem. Hal bases his argument on 2 major factors. One is, normally when you see a shortage in an occupation, you see a concomitant rise of wages, and we don't see that as much. STEM wages have grown in the same rate as overall wages, more or less.
Acronym, please.
I'm sorry, thank you so much. Thank you. Science and science, technology. Science is technology, engineering, and math.
Science, technology, engineering, math.
Yeah. So the reason why I don't believe we would see that is twofold. One is we rely on immigration. So we have a domestic demand problem. We've filled it with foreign supply, which is fine and well and dandy, but we can't really rely on that in as much going forward, I believe. I think the Chinese and the Indians in particular are going to find greater and more rewarding opportunities at home as their engineering and science economies grow. So I think we're going to be more vulnerable. The second thing is there's a limit to how much companies can raise wages in this field because it's a global labor market. And so wages can't rise too much here because it makes companies less competitive. They'll just go offshore. With regard to this point about companies, about an excess of graduates, the problem with that is that, look, historically, we've always produced people who have an engineering degree who don't go into engineering. It's not because there's not a job in engineering. It's not because the wages aren't high. Wages in engineering and science are the 3rd highest wages in the country. It's because people just decide they don't want to be an engineer. Or they decide, like my cousin, who's a nuclear physicist, my cousin is a salesman. Now he's a salesman for some nuclear thing or whatever, but he's not in a STEM job, really. And so I think this notion that Hal says, well, that everybody coming out with a STEM degree is able and willing to go into a STEM job is just simply, historically, has never been the case. People have occupational choices for a lot of different reasons. In terms of the sort of that there are some people who have unemployment. The reality is the unemployment rate for scientists and engineers is very, very low. It's probably close to the lowest occupational unemployment of any occupation in America today. There is structural mismatch, there's no question about it. If you have a degree in data science, I guarantee you the unemployment rate is probably 0. You will get a job tomorrow if you have a degree in data science. In other words, the whole big data innovation, companies are desperate to find people there. If you're a COBOL programmer, you might have a harder time. Okay, so there you can see some of these. Much better. There we go. There you go. All right. All right. So that's where we rank on. There we go. So you can see where USA is here. South Korea. Here's Portugal, India. A bunch of countries. Japan, Denmark have made much greater progress. Yeah.
Just a quick question on private capital usage. If you look at the statistics that come out of the British Venture Capital Association, European Venture Capital Association, and you compare it to our own private Venture Capital Association, we have more money invested each year. We have better results from that venture capital money that's been invested. So how does that factor into this innovation progress going down? And yet I would say our private venture capital industry is much better than the rest of the world.
Yeah, so the question is about, we have more VC money, venture capital money than the Brits do, and it's better. Well, first of all, again, on all of these measures, I don't believe you can, the accurate measure on every individual international comparison is per something, per capita, per GDP. I mean, we have a death rate of 10 times the Canadians. 10 times more people die every year in America than the Canadians. Does that mean we're less healthy? No, we have 10 times more people. So you got to always do that. On a per GDP basis, we have less VC money, venture capital money than the Brits. Now, don't get me wrong. By the way, the other problem with US VC is if you look at the growth of VC in the US, and you look at essentially it's 0 stage, first stage, second, third. 0 stage meaning very early, almost, seed. That's what it is. And then second and third, which is, bigger companies, more established, they need another infusion of capital. The growth of second and third stage in the last 15 years has grown dramatically, so it's doubled. The growth of 0 and first stage has shrunk by half. So I think there is a structural problem. Now, whether that's a problem in the venture capital industry, that they're getting less risk averse, they're getting more risk averse and want to go to the easier returns at the later stage, or there aren't enough money deals, I don't know the answer to that, but I do think that's a problem. Just to be clear, and I'll get to this a little later, I don't mean to say that the U.S. doesn't have incredible strengths. We have, in many ways, the best science entrepreneurial system in the world. We produce science-based entrepreneurship better than anybody else. I don't deny that. But I don't think we do anywhere near as well on engineering innovation, which is why the Germans are so dominant, for example, in manufacturing. And I think we have more competitors now in that science-based innovation space. And lastly, we could do better. So let me try to get through some of that. Okay. So what's the cause of all this? Why did this all happen? I suppose I could just put up a slide that just says China, because that does answer a lot of it. But essentially the bottom line is, as I said, in the 70s, when I was here, the 60s, companies would look around the country when they want to put a new factory or a new lab or whatever, and they'd say, where's the best place in the country for us to do that? And states would respond by trying to have good economic development programs. Today, companies essentially shop the world. You go and you talk to any major technology company today, and they will tell you that they get visits on the order of once every couple of weeks from a big delegation from a foreign country that says, are you planning to build? As I was talking to one major chip company, it's not the one you think, and I said, and they said, big delegation came and said, we understand that you're going to be probably planning to build the next generation wafer factory at this size, nanometer scale, and we want to be the place to do that, and here's what we're willing to give you. No taxes for 30 years, free land, workforce training, whatever it is. So exactly the kind of deals states have done, but much, much bigger.
Can you divulge which country that was?
It was Singapore, yeah, which is actually one of the most sophisticated countries in the world when it comes to this stuff.
I didn't know they had any land.
It was a high-rise.
AMD bulldozer chips?
And so what you can see is that the share of American corporate investment that is offshore, in other words, that's in other countries, has grown dramatically from about 30% to 70%. Why is that? Which is, well, go ahead.
What do you think the impact of that very suspicious death of that American engineer in Singapore will have in investing in that country or similar countries?
What do I think? What is?
Are you familiar with the recent report of an American engineer, PhD, I forgot his name, but he died under very suspicious circumstances after doing dual attack research for a company that was funded, I think, primarily by the Chinese, but he's based out of Singapore. And so this has been circulated.
Oh, and there was fraud?
Well, he was concerned that he might be working on sensitive technology as an American for a company that was really a front for Chinese. And he died under very suspicious circumstances, and there's suspicion that maybe Chinese or some other foreign entity staged his death because of this, his reluctance to deal with this, and he wanted to pull back. And the story just broke a couple of weeks ago.
This is the Taiwanese guy?
I'm sorry?
The Taiwanese guy?
He was American.
Okay, yeah, but he was, okay, there's another guy who just died, who's a scientist, but yeah.
You were aware
It may be the same guy. He was an American, but he was Taiwanese descent. Okay. Well, let me come back, because I'm going to come to that in a second here. I'll touch on that. So why is it that all of a sudden, really all of a sudden, really, this stuff wasn't going on in the 90s, and it just accelerated, went to a new phase in the 2000s. Why? Well, you know, when we used to get delegations coming through in the 90s from other countries talking to us, they would actually say things like, we're working to build up our steel industry. We're working on our shipbuilding industry. And you're like, okay, whatever. They don't say that anymore. Every single country that comes by and talks to us, we're trying to build a global innovation competitive advantage in every single technology industry we can find. And so what happened is countries decided that that's where they wanted to place their bets, which is exactly the sweet spot that we were in. They're going directly after our market share, and they're doing it through a raft of innovative and interesting policies. For example, they're vastly expanding their government support for research and development. They're vastly expanding support for university research, STEM education production, tax incentives, lower tax rates. And you can see it, and they also have plans. High-tech strategy in Germany, science technology plan in Japan. I could list, as we do in the book, 25 others. Now, the other problem here, and this gets to your question, or your point, it would be one thing if we were facing countries that were competing through essentially just trying to win the race by doing better exercises. But what we're really facing are countries that are trying to win the race by bribing the judges to vote against, to call against us, and tripping us when we're running. In other words, there's been this dramatic rise, and I think people really underestimate this, the dramatic rise of what we call innovation mercantilism. In other words, countries that are putting in place policies to cheat. And China's the worst, by far. They're the biggest, they're the most egregious, but they're not the only ones. India, Brazil, Malaysia, Argentina. So let me give you a couple of examples. If you're a US company, even if you're a mid-sized US company and you want to go to China to build something, you almost always have to do it through a joint venture. If you're a Chinese company and you want to come to the US and build something, you don't. Why do they want a joint venture? Because that's the way they suck out the technology, the knowledge, the information, and put it back into Chinese companies. Now, that's sort of one path the Chinese have. The other path they have is just straight out theft. So if you look at the latest reports from the US government on cyber attacks and cyber theft, the report essentially says what we have argued for a long time, and what we've talked to FBI and counterintelligence people who confirm this. The Chinese are engaged in a systemic attack on US companies, US laboratories, to suck out as much knowledge as possible. Another thing they do is they manipulate standards. So if you have a cell phone, it has a particular type of encryption standard, basically all around the world. Chinese decided they didn't like that standard. They created a thing called WAPI. WAPI is an inferior standard. Talk to Annie, might agree with that. It's not really a good standard. But the Chinese did this to advantage their companies and to disadvantage foreign companies. India now. India has put in place a rule called the PMA, Preferential Market Access. So if you're an American technology company and you have aspirations of serving Indian markets, how many people in India? 1.3 billion. Fast-growing market. You're out of luck because the Indian law now says by 2020, 80% of all IT products sold in India have to be produced in India. They just recently issued a tender for a fiber optic network where they said no foreign company, even a foreign company based in India, a foreign company producing the stuff in India, can bid on this contract. So we see this over and over and over again. Countries are trying to win through manipulating the trading system. And it's very, very hard to win when you're competing against it. Good example also in China. China, after 2000, they entered the WTO. Everybody thought, oh, China's going to liberalize, right? We'll get them into our system. They'll become more like us. That was the theory. That theory essentially has completely fallen down. The opposite has happened. The share of the Chinese economy controlled by state-owned enterprises has grown by about 8 percentage points over the last decade. So SOEs, state-owned enterprises, now control over 50% of the Chinese economy. Now, why does that matter? That matters for a couple of reasons. One is that the average profit rate of state-owned enterprises is negative 6%. Now, if you're an American company and you've got to earn 10 to 15% profits to meet your shareholder demands, you are at a delta of 20 percentage points. Really hard to compete with a company that has a 20 percentage point advantage. Not to mention currency manipulation, not to mention the fact that the Chinese government intentionally advantages their own companies over foreign companies. So I don't want to just pick on China. I like picking on China because they are so egregious. But again, you can go to many, many countries that do this, yeah.
You mentioned joint ventures in China.
Yeah.
How many of those joint ventures are actually fronts for the state-owned enterprise investing?
The question is, how many are fronts for state-owned enterprises? I don't know the answer to that. Sometimes there are companies in China that appear to not be related to the government, but at least when you talk to Chinese others, it looks like they are. The Chinese system is very opaque. You don't really know what's going on. Go back to your point a little earlier. One of the things that's going on, we recently wrote a report called the 50 Ways to Leave Your Competitors' Woes Behind, and 50 Ideas to Fix U.S. Traded Sector Competitiveness. And one of the things we argued was to reform what's called CFIUS, which is a program that the DoD has to monitor foreign investment in companies, foreign companies buying in American companies where we think they might have sensitive technology that might hurt our ability to defend ourselves. Increasingly, the Chinese are bypassing CFIUS because they'll go and they'll buy this company, this company, this company, this company. None of the ones will trigger a CFIUS review, but if you put all four together, they will. And this is now, I would argue, what we're going to see over the next 5 years is the China threat will increasingly come from inward FDI. The Chinese now want to buy our technology. Now, you could say, well, that's all fine and good. You know, we buy theirs, they buy. First of all, we can't buy theirs, number one. But secondly, the problem with that is, if a German company comes into the U.S. and they buy an Illinois technology company, generally what they do is they don't suck out the information, the knowledge and the technology, and take it back to Germany and leave a shell behind. They're using it kind of to get a global platform. Thank you so much. The Chinese strategy is not that. The Chinese strategy is to go buy up with their $2 trillion they have in the bank, to buy up our companies and just take that knowledge. So, all right. So I think this is another fact that we don't really fully appreciate. You talk to a lot of American entrepreneurs, and they tend to have, which one of the things that's really great about America, they tend to have this very much of this kind of, cowboy spirit, this, I can beat anybody else, because I am good enough to do that. And that's wonderful, but that's not what's going on anymore. What's going on now is their company is competing against another company backed by the state. And I don't care how good an entrepreneur you are, how good a corporate leader you are, that's really, really tough. So I use the Boeing case here. Boeing's headquartered in Chicago now. It's really hard to compete with Airbus. I mean, leaving aside the 787 battery problems, which I think are, first of all, not Boeing's problems, they're Japan battery problems. Those will be fixed at some point, and the 787 will be a great plane. But leaving aside that, it's really hard to compete with a company that's giving your competitor $30 billion of launch aid, which is what the Europeans have done. And you can just go down the list. Cisco is competing with Huawei, a Chinese company that's massively subsidized. And this is the new reality that our companies face. Now, if it was a level playing field, I'm willing to put our companies up against their companies a lot of the days. But this is a different kind of playing field. So what have we done? Here's this new reality, both sort of good competition, good innovation, bad innovation policy. What have we done? Frankly, very, very little. We now have the highest corporate tax rate in the OECD. So we all know about Sweden, right? That socialist country in Sweden where the taxes are super high. The Swedes just lowered their tax. Our corporate tax rate is 35%, by the way, 39% when you include states. The Swedes just lowered theirs about 2 months ago from 28 to 22. The Canadians just lowered theirs to 15. We now have, as I said, the highest rate, but also among the highest effective rates. So 35 is the rate, but there's what's called an effective rate. Not everybody pays the full 35. Everybody says, oh, look at some companies that you see in the paper, they don't pay any taxes. Now, you put all of that together, our companies still pay anywhere between 5th, 4th, 3rd, 1st highest effective rates in the world. We have a lagging high skill immigration. Let me just go through the lagging high skill immigration laws. Other countries are actually going in the opposite direction. They're making their high skill immigration more generous. We're 23rd, as I said, in the production of scientists and engineers. You talked about infrastructure. We're 23rd in quality. We have a relatively increasing regulatory burden. We also aren't investing. So these are the growth in federal R&D expenditures by country over the last, sort of a little bit outdated there, but those are the best data you can get. And you can see other countries making much bigger investments than we are. We have essentially stopped expanding federal R&D. We don't want to do it anymore, because if we do that, we have to do one of two things that we don't want to do. We have to take money away from retired people, or we have to raise taxes. Well, there are only two choices. So as a country, we've said, well, we don't want to raise taxes, and we don't want to take money away from entitlements, and so that's what we're left with, just simply not investing. Yeah?
Just a quick question on growth in R&D. Do you have any statistics that show the efficiency of that R&D usage? So your charts would change because, as an example, maybe Korea doesn't get as much out of its R&D as we get out of ours. Are there any statistics that show that comparison?
Well, maybe they get more, too. So, yeah. No, there aren't, because it's a very, very hard measure to get. There's a recent study we did, September last year, on the effective sequestration, federal sequestration in the budget on the R&D component and what the effect would be. And if you, again, if you just look at the scholarly models, the scholarly studies in the U.S., for every dollar of added to the federal R&D stock, there's an added impact to productivity. Now, yeah, the reality is some R&D is better, some R&D is worse. But one thing that is interesting that I think is, you can have a debate about it, but I think it's at least interesting to point out, our R&D tends to be, at the government level, it's really interesting because it's a flip side here. At the government level, it tends to be more focused on basic relative to other countries. Other countries are placing their bets much more on the applied side. And the reason they're doing that is that basic research is a global good. Everybody can take advantage of our basic research. And we get to take better advantage of it because we're closer to it. But other countries can also take advantage of it. They're placing a much bigger bet on applied R&D because they see the direct benefits to their companies and their economy. On the corporate side, it's just the opposite, which is really surprising to us. We found in the book, if you look at the growth of corporate R&D over the last decade and you compare that to about 20 countries, corporate R&D is basically, think about it as a pie, 3 slices. There's basic research, there's applied research, and there's development. Development in the U.S. is the biggest share. The slices for applied and basic have gone down. They've gotten smaller for U.S. corporations over the last decade. We are the only country where that's happened. Every other country, the slices have stayed the same or gotten bigger, which to us is a problem, because if you've read the work of Clay Christensen at Harvard Business School, Clay's point is about that really where you get benefits from is what he calls disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation doesn't come from making this a little bit smaller. And you get more disruptive innovation at the corporate side from basic research and applied research. And I think that is a problem that we have. I think there's some things we can do to fix that, but I mean, just quickly go through. Here you can see scientists and engineers. Again, very, very little growth in scientists and engineers. This is interesting. We did a study 2 years ago, and we had no preconceptions of what we would find. We just said, how much money do we invest at the government level and the corporate level in our research universities, in research? Given the fact that we have really great research universities in America, we thought we would be close to the top. In fact, we're not. We're 22nd. Sweden, that's twice as much, over twice as much. Switzerland, Netherlands, Finland, Austria, Australia, Canada. Now, in one level, they're not, the reason why are they doing that? They're doing it because they haven't been as good at innovation as we are, and they see this go as a path to catch up and get better. This number, by the way, is going down. We're 23rd in the rate of growth, and almost all of that loss is at public universities. University of Illinois, University of Kentucky, I mean these kinds of universities, because states have backed off over the last decade because of budget problems. They're not putting that money into research in much. That's where almost all of the losses from, yeah.
Does not our universities also have to change? I think there was recently an article in the Chronicles for Higher Education saying that one of the big issues about innovation is that we have tenure, and that tenure is really a big, it's mitigating against the innovative spirit in our universities.
Yeah, so I'm going to get to that in a minute. So don't get me wrong, by the way. I am the, just to be clear, it sounds like I'm all about money. I think money is really important. Don't get me wrong, money is really important. But if you don't couple money with institutional innovation, you're not going to get the big bang for the buck, if you will. Other countries are doing both those, and we're not. We're not doing either, and I'll get to that in just a second. So what's the solution? We talk in the book about these 8 I's: investment, intention, insight, incentives, investment, institutional innovation, information technology, and international. I'm not going to go through all this. I want to really hit on 4. There we go. I think we need to do 4 big things, in Washington at least. One is on tax. We need to make sure that our tax code allows American companies, or companies in America, to be competitive and supports innovation. Don't have that slide. All right, so I'm just going to talk about it. So on tax, for example, in 1992, America had the most generous research and development tax credit in the world. Research and development tax credit essentially is a credit for a company. When they put some money into research, they can take a credit off of their taxes. Economists think this is a good thing because there's what are called externalities from research. When a company invests $1 into research, on average, society gains $2. So there are what are called spillovers. Companies don't capture all the returns from research, so they tend to underinvest from a societally optimal point of view. That's why we have the R&D tax credit. So as I said, in '92, we were number 1. Today, we're 27th. Not because our credit has gotten worse, but because every other country, 26 other countries have decided they want to expand their credit. So if you go to France, you get a credit that is 5 times more generous than the United States. Not only that, I could pick a lot of countries. I'll just pick France here. If you go to France and you are a company and you think, you know, this national lab in France or this university in France, they've got some really great technical capabilities. I'd like to fund a research center there. The French government will give you a 60-cent tax credit on every $1 you invest. Now, in the United States, if a U.S. company invests at Illinois Institute of Technology or at Argonne, they actually get dinged for that. They don't get the full credit. They get 70 cents on the dollar for the credit. So we're doing the exact opposite. We're penalizing companies that partner with our universities and labs for research. Other countries, Korea, Japan, a whole boatload of countries that we've studied, do the exact opposite. Okay, talent. There's a big debate, as I said, but I really do think we need to do a much better job of producing engineers and scientists, and in particular, we need to do a better job of how we're training those engineers and scientists. You go to your point about tenure. We talk in the book a little bit about Olin College. Anybody familiar with Olin? We love Olin College. Olin College is an engineering school, a 4-year school outside of Boston. It has actually one of the higher rates of female enrollment of any engineering school. It has no tenure, it has no departments, and every engineering student studies engineering, design, and business. That is why Olin is on track to produce twice as many student business startups, so when students graduate, new companies that form out of Olin, twice as many as MIT. So this is an institutional innovation that I think is quite interesting. Now again, not to say that you can replicate Olin everywhere, but my understanding from talking to the president recently is Olin has a partnership with the University of Illinois, I think in Champaign, but I'm not sure if it's that campus or here in their engineering school, to kind of take the Olin model and integrate it a little bit into their technology. Okay, what do I mean by that? We simply cannot win if we're not willing to invest in innovation and technology, but I would argue we've got to do more than that. You look at why Germany leads the world in manufacturing. Germany runs a big trade surplus, including a trade surplus with China. It's not because they have low wages. The German manufacturing wages are 40% higher than US manufacturing wages. It's because the German companies are so technologically sophisticated when it comes to engineering. And they do that for two reasons. They have a great apprenticeship program, which we need to replicate. And they have a great system of what are called Fraunhofer Institutes. These are over 60 institutes that have been in place since the late 50s. And these are 2/3 funded by German corporations and 1/3 funded by the government. They're affiliated with universities, and they focus on applied problems that companies need solving, whether it's in robotics or biotechnology or computer-aided manufacturing, or you name it. And the Germans are great because they will shut these centers down very, very quickly. So if you got a center and you're not doing well, you get shut down. They move the money over somewhere else to create another center. So the president, so we proposed this several years ago, or 2 years ago. President Obama has proposed, if you listen to the State of the Union, what he wouldn't say and can't say because there's no way we're allowed to imitate anybody outside of America, where he's trying to create essentially a similar system in America called the National Network of Manufacturing Innovation. I think this is exactly what we need to do. The administration did fund one on their own through the Defense Department in additive manufacturing, which is this basically sort of related to 3D printing, the ability to print parts. This is really important if you're in the military and you're on a ship in the middle of nowhere and a part breaks down and you need a new part. You can't wait for somebody to fly it in 10,000 miles away. But in any case, there's an effort to build a whole national network of these, and we're going to need to find the political will to do that. Yeah.
One thing you didn't mention about Germany is the way that they align the interests of the workers with the interests of the corporation with the co-determination. In fact, after World War II, it was the Americans that insisted that there be union representation on boards of directors. So you had from the very beginning, in rebuilding after World War II, the alignment between the interests of workers and the interests of the enterprise management. And you see this in the way that young people are tracked with the steward apprenticeships. They're not smart enough to go to college or pass the test, but everyone's involved in the economy getting trained. And I don't think that's an insignificant part of allocation of human resources in the
Yeah. Yeah, so I was on a panel recently, and then the panel after me was the CEO of, I think it was BASF. I can't remember exactly. I think that was the company, but a big German company. And one of the other CEOs on the panel was like, how come you guys don't move a lot more production to China like we're doing? He said, my board won't let me. He said, well, why? Well, my board is half union members. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to that system, don't get me wrong. First of all, we're never going to replicate that system in a million years, so I think it's sort of a fruitless path to go down there and hope that we'll get that. But there's some advantages to that, which is that German companies and Austrian companies and some of those companies, when you talk to their management and their engineers, you ask them, well, why didn't you go to China right away? I mean, they don't not go to China. They're global companies. But because they say, look, we understand we've got to cut our costs to meet the China price, but we think we can do it through engineering and skills and restructuring the production system. U.S. companies, again, broad generalization, look at the same set of facts and they say, gosh darn, we don't have 5 years. Our shareholders won't give us 5 years. It's a risky thing. We're going to have to go to capital markets. We're going to have to invest. We don't have 5 years. We've got to do it now. Let's move to China. Germans get to the same result oftentimes because they're able to take a little bit longer term view. So I do think that to some extent, where I think that system is good is it leads to companies having a little bit longer time horizon. Where I think it's bad is that it really does limit beneficial restructuring. There are workers over there that resist automation. I'm going to go to a couple people I haven't heard from. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think that like the Chicago manufacturing renaissance here in Chicago, I mean, it premised on actually bringing labor leaders in and business leaders to the table to talk about how do you keep manufacturing Chicago on the cutting edge. And I think that's also how you build that political will for the, because I agree that national network is essential. And so for example, we made a lot of headway, working with the Chicago Teachers Union, for example, to support a manufacturing education program. And, you know, there you have access to, you know, people, you know, groups that are otherwise, you know, have been alienated for various, you know, legitimate reasons from those kinds of economic development decisions. But I think, you know, even though there might be some disadvantages in terms of the short term, in terms of timeframes, but I think in the long term, in terms of creating those political alliances so that you can really move national projects that have, you know, immediate advantage for workers as well as, you know, business owners.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. We created this thing a couple of years ago called the Charter for the Revitalization of U.S. Manufacturing, and we had a number of signatories, about 20 signatories to it, and it was laid out the whole process we went through for about 4 months, and we had the AFL-CIO, we had part of NAM, National Association of Manufacturers, and other groups, all agreed to this charter, which included, you know, sort of big concessions. AFL-CIO agreed to lower taxes for companies, and NAM agreed to some tougher trade enforcement things. So I agree with you 100%. To build the political coalition that we need to move forward, we have to do that. Let me see if I can get through a little more of this. Oh, one last thing on tech that's interesting. I mentioned it because I think it's a great model for what states and even cities can do. Actually, two things there. One thing we're seeing around the world, in particular in Europe, there's this new model that countries are, and some regions in Europe, like in German states, German land are doing, and these are called innovation vouchers. And what they do is they give small and medium-sized companies, technology companies, they give them a small voucher equivalent of about $20,000, $25,000. They get to use this voucher anywhere in that country or that state to solve technical problems that they have with a university or a lab. Now, I asked a Dutch official who runs that program what was the effect of that program, and he said the #1 effect of this program was it made our universities reorganize themselves to become customer-facing. Now these universities were out competing for these vouchers. We're the most friendly. We have the least bureaucracy. We can help you the most. And it really changed sort of the dynamic. It put a sort of market spin on this, if you will. Now, again, that's not to say that these countries have abandoned direct funding of universities or labs. They haven't. They've added this as a new tool. There's only two places in America we know that do this. Only one place I know of, Iowa. You might want to look at it. Iowa has a very interesting voucher program like that. It's an innovation voucher program. So I think that's an interesting idea. Trade, I'll just say, look, at the end of the day, we can't win this battle, no matter how well we do domestically, if we don't have a much more robust enforcement of the global trading rules. I give the administration some credit there, or more than some credit. They're making big efforts on that. But frankly, they need, if you've ever dealt with USTR, United States Trade Representative Office, it's a really wonderful place. Anybody who says that government workers don't work hard, they should get emails from USTR officials on 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, which I do. So these people work incredibly hard for our country, but it's a teeny little agency. So we've got to fund that sort of effort on a much more serious basis. So let me just kind of wrap up, overcoming the hurdles. What are the big hurdles? Well, you know, one of the big hurdles, obviously, is partisanship. We have one party that's devoted to equality and one party that's devoted to liberty. And we don't have any party that's devoted to innovation, competitiveness, and growth, really. I mean, both parties have some ideas that get you there, but fundamentally, neither party is focused on this in a serious way. The other big problem we have, though, is it's more of an intellectual problem. And that's that the dominant consensus in Washington is that we shouldn't have an innovation policy, that countries don't compete, and that you should leave it up completely to the market. Now, you really aren't, I can see by your faces, you just, oh, I'm exaggerating. Trust me, I'm not exaggerating. Larry Summers, who was head of Obama's National Economic Council, Bush's advisors, they all say the same thing. Countries don't compete. Paul Krugman says this. Countries don't compete. Boeing competes against Airbus. We don't compete against Europe. If Boeing were to go out of business because of Airbus subsidies, you know what would happen? Those workers would just go get new jobs. And we'd be exactly in the same. We might even be better off. Now, this would be hard to imagine given that the aeronautics industry pays the highest wages almost in the country and has the highest value added. By definition, you're going to go to lower value added, lower wage jobs. So there's a deep, deep view in Washington that we don't compete. There's a deep, deep view in Washington that we're #1. There's something magical about America. De Tocqueville said this, American exceptionalism. Yeah, I buy that, but it doesn't mean that we're entitled to win the race. So there's a sort of very, very compelling sense in Washington that we're number one, we have been number one, we always will be number one, just because of who we are. And lastly, there's this view that you don't really want to have a government innovation policy because the market always gets it right. So I was on Fox, the Fox Business Channel a while ago, debating a guy, a journalist of all things, on the R&D tax credit, and he accused me of being a statist for supporting the R&D tax credit because I was picking winners. Now, if you know how the R&D tax credit works, any company in any industry, any size, any nationality gets this credit as long as they're conducting the R&D in America. So I'm a statist because I think that more R&D is better than less. So he's an extreme case, but he's representing a view in Washington that government innovation policy is really not needed. There's another great line that a lot of people in this field on the other side quote from Robert Solow, who a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who once said, "Innovation is manna from heaven." And what these people interpret that to mean, I'm not saying Solow meant this, is that innovation just happens. It's like background radiation in the universe. There's nothing we can do to either speed it up or slow it down. Now, as you would imagine, I think these views are incredibly ill-advised and destructive moving forward, but they're very, very dominant in Washington. Now, after I haven't fully depressed you, by the way, I just got to say, I had to live with this for 2 years writing this book, so I'm even more depressed than you are. Does that mean we're sort of sunk? And I think it doesn't mean that. I think we have to think about who we want to be as a country. If you think about two cities that back in the 60s that were, or the 50s that were, doing okay, Buffalo and Boston, they really took quite divergent paths. Boston lost a lot of its industries. It made shoes at one time. It made sort of metalworking, so lost all that. But Boston transformed itself through innovation. Incredible, you go there today in Kendall Square, biotech hub, IT hub, incredible. Route 128. And that's really the choice our country faces. Are we going to be Buffalo, which is sort of this inability to invest, inability to come together collectively, I think as you alluded to, inability to innovate and move into new industries, or transform existing industries? And I think the real answer to that is that we'll see. There's a great quote from Winston Churchill, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Churchill said, "You can always trust the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other possibility." So I think we're close to the exhaustion point. I do think some of the good side of this is there are an increasing number of corporate leaders who are speaking out. Paul Otellini, when he was head of Intel, was a good example. Jeff Imholt, currently from GE. The CEO of Boeing, why am I blanking on his name, McNerney. There are a lot of good CEOs now who are saying, you know what, we want to make America work, even though we're global companies. We're invested in making America work, but you got to help us. And there's also, I think, a growing awareness in the administration. I give this administration a lot of credit for calling out the importance of innovation in manufacturing. And there's a growing awareness among both parties on the Hill. The real question, I think, is, A, are we going to be willing to make the compromises we need? The Democrats tend not to want to have a lower corporate tax rate. The Republicans tend not to want to have bigger investments in things like research and development, our universities, our skills. And the question is, can we sort of put together a grand deal that puts all that together? So I think the jury is out, but I do think that one of the things that really will make a difference, and I don't just say this I think what will help make a difference is when groups like your own, when all members of Congress, as Tip O'Neill said, politics is local. And if local folks talk to their elected officials and say, you know what, we understand that gun control is incredibly partisan. We understand that abortion and health care incredibly partisan. But these set of issues are not partisan, should not be partisan, and we want you, whatever party you are, to really move forward with this agenda. I think if that begins to happen more seriously, then I think we can maybe make a difference. But I don't think we have unlimited amount of time. I think Frankly, we probably have about 10 years. And after 10 years, we start to go down the British path. And you really don't want to go down the British path, because the British path is sort of beyond the path of no return, if you will. The British have lost so much of their industrial capacity. They've lost so much of their capability to be innovative. Now, give the Brits credit. They're working real hard. They're working a lot harder than we are. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, just did a great speech. They're putting in place all sorts of policies. So they waited too long, but now they're trying. We don't want to do what the Brits do. We want to try it before we get to that point. So, as I said, I think the jury is out, but hopefully we will all make the right choice to be in a good position. Yes?
I was wondering if you could comment on, it seems like we've gone to an economy that makes things to an economy that pays off its debts and sort of saving them. So companies that are based in Chicagoland are investing in other states that have better tax incentives in other countries, and that changes the high-wage jobs that are here. I see that, you know, 5% corporate tax that we have in the state is not going away anytime soon, but it's a disincentive. Can you really directly say to these government leaders that you're hindering long-term innovation and the jobs and sustainability in this, you know, our local economy?
You know, I at one time in the 90s, I was head of the Rhode Island Economic Policy Council. Rhode Island had the second worst economy in the early part of the 90s. It was a terrible economy. It was losing about a percentage of its jobs, a percentage of its population a year, 1% a year were moving out of the state. So the governor created this council, and we actually did get a lot done. We created the highest R&D tax credit, et cetera. But Rhode Island is still a terrible, it kind of came back a bit. Now it's probably the second worst economy again. And there are cities that are going bankrupt, literally going bankrupt. And you would think in that environment with that much pain that the state would change in a serious way. And yet the barriers to change are quite high. So Illinois is probably in a similar situation because, you know, you can sort of see the handwriting on the wall. You're losing, in this case Rhode Island, and Illinois probably too. You know sort of why you're losing. You know that if you keep losing what the result will be, and yet you can't do anything. And I think ultimately states have to bite the bullet and say, look, we have to consume less. Really, it's a choice to consume less today and invest instead. Move money from consumption to investment. Cutting the corporate tax rate or expanding the R&D credit or whatever other incentives, that essentially is an investment. That means somebody else is going to have less money somewhere else. And those are tough political things to do. But again, if you don't do that, if you don't make those choices, I mean, that's, again, I think what people misunderstand is you really have to look around the world and you have to look and see what other countries are doing. I mean, it's phenomenal. Again, look at Great Britain. Look at England, Great Britain, UK. They just put in place 3 months ago a thing called the patent box. Patent box says that any income you make from a company related to innovation. So let's just say you're a company and you get some of your profits from widgets and some of your profits from this R&D thing you do, and you sell a bunch of those things. Those profits are going to be taxed at half the rate of the regular corporate tax rate. Half. There's 8 countries now that do this. Now, you can argue whether it's good or bad. I actually like it. But the point is, these countries aren't standing still. And we did an event on the patent box when we had a Dutch government treasury official, and I asked him, I said, how did you guys do this? Why did you do it? Or how could you get it done? And he said, look, one of the advantages they have is their right-wing party is, if this is the center, their right-wing party is here and their left-wing party is here. You know, our parties are like that. But he said our center-right party said, if we don't cut taxes and become more competitive, our companies aren't going to do well. And the center-left party said, if we don't cut taxes and become more competitive globally, our workers aren't going to do well. So they said, okay. And then they figured out other ways to make that up. And so, anyway, long answer, but I think elected officials many times really, they're still stuck back in the 20th century when the competition was nowhere near as fierce.
Growing up in all of Boston, which you mentioned as a success story in the presentation.
Could you talk a little louder, please?
Yeah, so speaking to this lady's point about the difficulty that local and state government sometimes has to implement progressive policies for innovation. You mentioned Boston at the end of the presentation as a sort of model for success, essentially. Can you name some of the, or describe some of the sort of salient policies at the state and local level that help Boston transform its economy?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one of those things where, unfortunately, Boston got there in part mostly because of the assets that it had. And so, thank you. MIT, Harvard, incredible amount of defense spending, MITRE, some of these other corporations that were able to translate that into innovation. They also had, to this gentleman's point, they had the second best venture capital hub in the country. They started venture capital, E.D. Little, what, no. Anyway, started venture capital back in the, pardon? Bain. Well, now they have Bain. So they had all these advantages. They actually, they're this incredible importer of really, really well-educated people. And those people stay, a lot of them. There's one study that showed that if you just took MIT graduates, companies that have come from MIT would be the 8th largest or something like that in the country. So there were some policies that helped, but overall, I think in the Massachusetts case, it was just that they had this incredible luck to have these great institutions. I think if you look around the country and you say, well, where are some other places that are doing interesting things? You can find really great examples in lots of places. I look at Utah, for example. You wouldn't think of Utah as an innovation hub, maybe, but Utah actually, if you look at its universities, it produces more patents, startups, new companies out of its universities than almost any university in the country. Now, you don't sort of think of University of Utah, again, as like on the same caliber of MIT or Caltech. And they aren't in terms of just the overall amount that they do. But they have an incredibly well-developed innovation system in Utah to help their faculty and move technology out, to help entrepreneurs come in. So there's lots of examples like that around the country where people are doing interesting things. And again, I go to your point, I really think the question is much, much more. It's not a question of what to do. I think if you took 10 people here in this room and we sat down for a week, a couple of days, pretty straightforward to figure out what to do. It's not that. And you can look at best practice studies. If you go to SSTI.org, State Science and Technology Institute.org, you'll find every week a great list of best practices in innovation, technology, based economic development. It's really a question of political will. And that goes up to this meta level. I published this blog today on our website, itif.org, and it basically said, you've heard of a little twist on Kennedy's statement, and it said, ask not what you can do for innovation, ask not what innovation can do for you, ask what you can do for innovation. And what I meant by that was, fundamentally, as a society, I think we have to make a choice, which is, do we want to sort of go for current consumption, or do we want to go for future investment? And Americans largely have made the choice, which is current consumption. And other countries have made the choice, future investment. And so again, I think that's something where I wish our political leaders would challenge Americans more on that. I know it's not popular to challenge your voters, but I always remember a great quip by Alan Simpson, Senator, Republican from Wyoming. It turned out 2 weeks before he retired from the Senate, which is probably why he made the quip. But he was giving a speech in Washington, and he started off, he said, you know, a lot of Americans are fed up with American politicians, but let me tell you, I'm fed up with the American public. And I thought that was a pretty good quip, and I think we should talk more about that, but that's my own view. I think we all have it's not like politicians are not reflecting our will. They're reflecting our will to some extent, yeah.
Could you just comment on the impact of reshoring? I mean, I've heard that a lot, and yeah, it's questionable. Is it really significant, or is it something that's just going to live?
Yeah, so there's this notion or this concept now that I think is taking a lot of people's view, letting us off the hook, which is, yeah, we lost all this manufacturing, but now there's sort of, the pendulum went to China. Now there's this thing called a reshoring, instead of offshoring, reshoring. And a good example of that, if you read the Atlantic Monthly, or the Atlantic story, the cover story of General Electric's Louisville appliance plant, I think it was 3 months ago. And the story basically is all very much about reshoring. And to give GE the credit they're due, they have reshored some of their appliance production back from, I think, Mexico into their Louisville factory. wonderful. But the author takes this one anecdote, this one factoid, this one case, and extrapolates it. Now, if you look, so that appliances are in a particular industrial classification code, which is around what's called kitchen appliances and household appliances. If you look at what's happened to the trade deficit in that industrial code since 2010, the trade deficit's increased by 32%. So totally the opposite of a reshoring story. We're actually importing more kitchen appliances and exporting fewer. Or we may be exporting the same and we're importing whatever. The delta has grown 32%. So there was a blog, again, on our website that discusses that. So I think to be fair to the reshoring argument, there have been some factors that have changed that make it less that lower the relative disadvantage we have. So one of those is natural gas production, the amazing revolution in fracking and natural gas. So a lot of energy-intensive industries, the U.S. is a much better place from an energy cost perspective. That's nice. But if you really look at where our other advantages have come from, they're not advantages you really want. So one of the reasons why we're getting a little bit of reshoring is because our manufacturing wages have declined. And the other reason is that our dollar has declined. Now, I think, frankly, the dollar should decline much, much more. I think this is going back to our current, what does a high dollar do? It means you can go to Walmart and buy cheap stuff. A low dollar means you got to pay more. But really, what do you think about that? What is a high dollar doing for us? A high dollar is basically, for every person here who has a child, it's basically saying to your child, I'm really, really enjoying all that stuff I'm buying at Walmart. Oh, and by the way, you're paying for it in 30 years. That's really all it is, because it's just a debt. We talk about this in the book, every 4 years over the 2000s, the average American household, if you added up the trade debt, in other words, the amount of stuff we're buying from other countries, minus the amount of stuff we're producing and giving to them, so add that debt up, every 4 years it equals a Jeep Grand Cherokee. So that's a lot. We get a Jeep Grand Cherokee for free every 4 years because we're decided we're going to keep our dollar high and we're going to not export as much. So I think that's. I think offshoring is still happening. I think reshoring is happening a little bit. One recent study showed that only about 8% of the manufacturing jobs that have come back, which, by the way, the manufacturing jobs recovery that we've had is one of the worst we've ever had. Everybody says, oh, it's great, we've gained a bunch of manufacturing jobs. You compare our recovery in manufacturing jobs to past recessions, this one's not very good. It just looks good because we'd lost so much. But anyway, if you compare that, about 8% of all those new manufacturing jobs have come from reshoring, so not a lot. So in other words, I think there's something there, and I think it's something we can build on. But what I worry about with the reshoring sort of mantra that groups like Boston Consulting Group perpetuate and instigated is that it takes the pressure off us. Oh, we're going to get reshoring. Well, we don't really have to worry about our corporate tax code. We don't really have to worry about creating a great training and apprenticeship program, doing the kinds of programs that we'd have, the Chicago Manufacturing High School, which I know. Yeah, Austin Polytechnic, great program. I've been out there. Okay, we'll just do that in Chicago. We don't need that in other cities. And that's what I worry about. The pressure is not going to get any less. It'll get worse, and we got to keep really working hard.
I think this has got to be our last question.
All right, I don't think, sir, right there in the front, I haven't.
You really get it.
Thank you.
Thank you for all the work you do. You're a national treasure.
Thank you.
I want to ask you about something you said about, putting work over to China and why we do it and maybe the Germans don't do it as much. There's an old saying, if you have a hammer, every problem starts looking like a nail. And I'm wondering if in Germany they feel they have that hammer of a huge amount of engineering and tech talent. Therefore, we'll look at this problem as an engineering and tech problem and design better processes to be able to compete so we don't have to shift as much work overseas. Whereas in the United States, we're graduating something like 10 times as many people every year with business degrees versus engineering degrees, but we tend to think of it more as a managerial problem and as a problem where we have to shift people and shift production mandates more than rely on our native abilities.
100% agree with that. I don't have data on this, but it just seems anecdotally true from my experience, was that German managers tend to be a higher ratio of engineers. Our managers tend to be a higher ratio of finance people. Finance people tend to do better in U.S. companies. I was on a panel 2 years ago. This is the panel I mentioned with the BAS CEO. The panel I was on was with Clay Christensen, but it was also with Jeff Bezos from Amazon and Paul Jacobs from Qualcomm. And it was really a fantastic panel. One of the best panels I've ever experienced. Anyway, and so we got in this conversation very, very quickly, right off the bat, which is, why are Amazon and Qualcomm so innovative? And Bezos says, look, when I make a decision to put a fulfillment center somewhere for Amazon, I got a ream of accountants, and finance people and a spreadsheet that you can't believe, and we'll tell you down to the penny where we should put it. But when I decided to roll the dice on the Kindle or on their big thing now, Amazon Cloud Services, I didn't have a spreadsheet because that was about risk and uncertainty. I had no idea. But you know what? I rolled the dice because I thought it was in the long-term interest of my company. And you ask Paul Jacobs the same way. Paul Jacobs' father, Irwin, started Qualcomm, so it's really still a family-owned company, even though they're both publicly traded. They're founder-based companies. And Paul Jacobs says the same thing. And I think there's something about the nature of certain, if you've read Steve Jobs' book by Walter Isaacson, if you haven't read that, called Steve Jobs, wonderful book. Why did Apple crater when Jobs left? Because they brought in people who were basically finance people. Jobs was not a finance people. And the other thing about Jobs, I thought, reading that book, Jobs made Apple work to be one of the greatest companies in the world because Jobs was passionate about it was his company. He wanted it to succeed. He wasn't worried about, well, in 3 years, I can cash out. I can get that great stock option thing. I can cash out and go down to Florida. That wasn't on the card. So anyway, long way of saying, I think one of the things we've got to do, and this is sort of a meta thing, and I think we've argued both in the book and most recently with a joint report with Brookings, we've got to become more of an engineering economy. Now, as I said, I think it takes two big things to succeed in the innovation race today. Science-based entrepreneurship, which we're good at. We've got to keep working on it, some tweaks, we've got to do better. And engineering. You've got to put both of those together. And the Germans are not as good on science-based entrepreneurship as we have. That's their Achilles heel, and they're working on that. But they are so much better on the engineering part. So that's one of the things why we proposed recently that the national government, the federal government, create a system of manufacturing universities. Basically, these would be 20 universities that would get about $20 million a year extra, where they would really focus on manufacturing engineering. They'd bring the business schools into them. They'd integrate design. And they would be working in conjunction with companies. They would be doing engineering co-op programs. I think that would be a really good way to sort of to infuse the kind of engineering skills we need, whether it's computer science or mechanical or chemical or other kinds of engineering. So I 100% agree with you. I think that we got to recognize that that's a challenge. I mean, I think, you ask, why did America do so great in the 60s? You watch Apollo 13, all those people. Because they were engineers. They're great engineers. And that's what I think we have to get back to. So 100% agree. But probably.
It's a cultural phenomenon, too. How do we change this culture from one of instantaneous gratification to one of delayed gratification?
You have to buy the book to find the answer to that. I have no idea. But I think you're partly right. So thank you all.